and thank you very much for having me. I always knew it was going to be a hard act to follow with Tony, but Tony's responsible for me being here, so but it's a great pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk to you about Exmoor National Park, and I'm going to give you a bit of a sense of what the National Park is, and then as a result of various conversations with Tony, I'm hoping that I'm going to pick up on various places on Exmoor and various themes that will be of interest to you, maybe of interest to some of the special interest groups that you have in here. At the very least, if nothing else, you'll get some very nice photographs of Exmoor. And I'm very conscious during the pandemic and the fact we've all sort of been kept indoors for so long, really, and changed a lot of our habits that certainly on Exmoor, during those difficult years, we did welcome a lot of people who had never been to a national park before, and certainly never been to Exmoor before, and people who were just desperate to get away from the world we were in during COVID. So, and in a sense for me, having worked at the National Park for over 20 years, that was a really interesting time because it made me reflect on what national parks are for. They were created at the end of the Second World War, just afterwards. We all know that the National Health Service was created just after the Second World War. What we know less is that the same administration that set up the National Health Service also set up national parks at the same time. And isn't it interesting that they thought about the nation's health and well-being through the National Health Service, but they also decided that some of the best parts of Britain should be protected for the benefit of the nation. So that's what they're there for. And one of our challenges in the 21st century is that we have such a diverse population now and people in different circumstances that national parks can seem quite remote to people. And what we often find is that even if people never visit, and we're so privileged to live near one here, near two in fact, that for some people they're never able to visit a national park for financial reasons or just because of where they live. But nevertheless, they still exist. So part of our role, I suppose, is to reflect on what we're for at a national park. And my particular role is I'm head of conservation and access, which is I'm responsible for the way we look after the national park, and I'm responsible for the rights of way network, the access land, for how people enjoy the national park, really. And we're very much a behind the scenes organisation, which I'll come on to, but we serve the place. So I always remind you staff that our role is we're public servants, we're paid for by government, but we serve the national park designation. So we're there for the national park. If the national park didn't exist, I would be doing something else. I'm not quite sure what, but I'd be doing something else. Right. I don't know if you can see that at the back. It's a bit bleached, isn't it? But just to remind us that national parks and areas of outstanding beauty were designated right across Britain. We have Scottish ones that have joined more recently, and we have AONB's Areas of Outstanding Natural Beauty in Northern Ireland. But the national parks are spread across England and Wales. There's 10 in England and 3 in Wales and 2 in Scotland. So there's 15 altogether. And Exmoor is one of the smallest. And as we always remind people, we're one of the poorest as well. We have the funding from government is very small for us. And you may have seen that my boss in the media before Christmas complaining about lack of funding. And when we were set up, we were given very clear remit by government. When I say we, I mean the national park was given a clear remit. And it's to conserve and enhance natural beauty, wildlife and cultural heritage. That's what we're for. So we're there to look after the place. Some people think that means keep it as it is, and that's absolutely not what we're there for. We're there to manage change. So we allow the place to change. We can't stop the place changing, but doing it in a way that preserves what's good about it and allows what's good about it to come forward and to resist really, really strongly adverse development and things that we don't want, things that will adversely affect Exmoor. But we're also there, not just to look after the place, but to actually give opportunities for understanding, enjoyment by the public. So we're there for everybody's benefit and to communicate the value of national parks and what's special about them. And one of the things about Exmoor, and I'll say this to a national parks audience, is we're in a tiny space with a most diverse landscape. So now I just put a series of images there to reflect on that. And S.H. Burton in 1954, who was a local person, wrote well about Exmoor, describes it as nowhere else in Britain can greater variety of scene be found than within the comparatively small territory of the Exmoor National Park. And that's, I can't improve on those words, you know, all those years ago. And I suppose really for this morning and for us, it's what kind of place is Exmoor to start with. And national parks, we tend to be a bit sort of, what's the word, putting Vaseline on the lens, a bit bucolic about it. We kind of see them as rather lovely, old-fashioned places. Of course, they are that, but they're also living places. So they are cultural landscapes. Not like American national parks where you have to pay to go in and nobody lives there. National parks are owned privately. So that land is by and large in private hands. And it is a working landscape. So there are farmers, there are foresters, there are activities that are part of the culture of the landscape that have gone on for centuries. They're also a place that provides inspiration for the nation. And that is what I think is most precious about national parks. That I've just been up to see my mum in London, and there's concrete everywhere and people putting plastic lawns down everywhere, and you just think, my goodness, what are we doing? And what is inspiring about a place? I love London, but what's inspiring about a place like that compared to this? And it's in southern England, it's just remarkable. And this is looking along the coast from, I don't know, probably somewhere near the end of the Valley of Rocks, I guess. Breathtaking landscape. And that's an old photograph, that's about 20 years ago, I think. Hasn't changed. We get some money, so the Exmoor National Park is the place, and I work for an organisation called Exmoor National Park Authority. So we are the organisation that serves the national park. We get our money from DEFRA, so we get it from central government. And that's part of our problem, because they don't give us enough. In real terms, we're on half the budget we were 10 years ago. So we should be getting 6 million a year from them, we're getting 3. And you can't do the same as we were doing 10 years ago, so we're really struggling. We have 65 staff, I'm responsible for 30 of them, and there's a whole load of things that I won't read out there that we do. But really unusually for national parks, we own 7% of the land. So I said national parks, the land is privately owned, but on Exmoor we happen to own 7%. And that is because Somerset County Council, and the national park is 2/3 in Somerset and 1/3 in Devon, Somerset County Council in the 60s, 70s and 80s decided it would be a good idea to acquire land for public benefit. So they compulsory purchased land off people who were going to do bad things, like plant conifers, where they shouldn't, rather than they basically took land in. So we own about 7% of the national park as a result of that. When the National Park Authority became independent in 1997, all that land came from Somerset to us. So I manage the estates team, which looks after that 7%. Most of it's moorland. We've got about, I think it's about 3,500 hectares of moorland. And we've got 600 hectares of woodland, some of the best. So if you go to Tar Steps and you walk up that valley, that's land we own, that's woodland we own. I can almost guarantee that if we didn't own it, it would be a commercial shoot now. And your access and enjoyment might be slightly different. So we don't publicise, we're not like the National Trust, we don't brag about what we own. We have a different ethos because we're a public body, we're not a charity. So we have a slightly different approach, and I don't complain about the National Trust bragging. I think it's a good thing that they speak loudly for what they do. But we're in a different position, which brings its own challenges. But what I should say is that we do manage the rights of way network, which is 1,000 kilometres, and we make all our own signs and all our own rights of way furniture, and we make it with hardwoods grown in our own woodlands. So, and that is, we are the only place in the country that does that. And we think it's the best way to do it. It makes total sense to us. Lots of famous people, or they come and go, don't they, some of them, but some are there forever apparently, which is wonderful. We have very little power. When I started, I was told by my boss, don't forget, Rob, we don't have any powers here really. Planning is about the only power we've got. But we have a lot of influence, and we have to use our influence. So we do a lot of influencing of people. The trouble with government is people come and go, ministers come and go, civil servants come and go. So once you've got somebody who you're talking to, next week they've gone. As we well know now. But you can't give up, you have to keep going on that journey. We've got great plans for Exmoor in terms of the big things that affect us all, like climate change and nature recovery. We think that we can plant trees on a lot of Exmoor that currently doesn't have trees, but we have to do it very sensitively, and we have to do it in a way that will work with the landscape. So this is a place called Simmonsbath, which I'll come back to in a little while. Little tiny village, I don't know if you know it. This is Simmonsbath here, and the brownie coloured map, the brownie coloured area of the maps is access land, so it's open access. It's also designated as special scientific interest, so it's SSSI. But these are pale green areas here, which are areas where we think we can create woodland in some of the valleys. That doesn't affect the open moorland, it doesn't affect the visitors' enjoyment, but it will increase woodland and therefore biodiversity and carbon sequestration in a landscape like this. So, like everybody else, we're thinking about how we react to the climate emergency. And that's just one example. We've, on another piece of land that we've owned for 30 years, I think, we've created woodland on those slopes. It's about 15,000 trees, I think, we've put in. And that's something we've done with volunteers and some of our own staff as well. And that's a project that's well going. I don't know how well you know Exmoor, but what's wonderful about this is our neighbour is incredibly positive, and he's now going to bring his land into for woodland creation there. He happens to be Stanley Johnson. So you're never that far away, are you? I'm not sure what you're far away from, but never mind. Let's move on from that one. We're responsible for not responsible for, but a fundamental part of what we do is trying to know more about the national park and understand it more, whether it's where visitors come from, why visitor numbers are as they are, or why things like we're losing heather. So on our moorlands, heather is in steep decline, and we ought to understand why. And so one of the things we get involved in a lot is monitoring and research of all aspects of the national park. Again, funding is a real problem for us there, because we'd love to spend far more money on research. We have a tiny budget for it, and really in this day and age we'd love to spend much more, but we can't. So what are the issues facing us? Well, uncertainty probably faces all of us, doesn't it? It's one way or the other. But a phrase there where our funding lags behind policy. And we have administrations at the moment that have lots of bright ideas about what to do, but actually the policies don't keep up. So sometimes throwing money at something can make a difference, but actually if you knew what you were trying to do and what the risks were, you might do it differently. I'll give you a very good example. We're planting a lot of trees in this country at the moment. Not very well, as you might have seen in the news recently. So there are quite a few examples now of trees, woodlands created and trees dying. It's just we're not very good at doing basic husbandry. We seem to have forgotten how to garden, basically. And we're not growing enough trees in this country, so if we want to plant more woodland, we either have to grow more trees or we have to import them. And we know what importing them means. It means we import disease. So we ought to be growing them here, but where are the people with the skills? So, we've got a local college here, Tiverton, that's just given up horticulture. My daughter has signed up to do it, and they cancelled the course because there weren't enough people. You think, come on, get people on your course. There are jobs in horticulture. We need people. We've got plenty of people who can wield a chainsaw and cut trees down, but we haven't got enough people who can grow trees, from taking an acorn and growing it. The skills required. So we've got lots of examples like that. The tail of Brexit, where are we all going at the moment? Who knows? Food security. What's land for? What's this land for in a national park? Is it for food? Is it for woodland? Is it both? Yes. Is it for alternative energy? Should we cover it in wind turbines? That all went away about 10 years ago, and national parks are currently reserved so that you cannot plant wind turbines. You can't put wind turbines on national parks. The result of that is people look at the areas around national parks, so they're ringed by areas of wind farms. But how should we approach this? Because it matters. We need green energy. We need to use less energy. We need green energy. So how do national parks respond to this? So where I am, And maybe it's because I've got a birthday this year, we all have, but you know, I've got a particular birthday. I think the last 50 years on Exmoor are not as challenging as the next 25. So in some ways I think, I'm not that far away from retirement. People who are 20 years younger than me, I think, wow, you've got a lot on your plate. And yeah, some of them haven't really realised it, I don't think. How does a landscape like this work in terms of, you know, housing? People can't afford to live there, in common with everywhere else, and the Highlands of Scotland, I was listening on the radio this morning. Employment, this is jobs here, these are some of the lowest paid people in the country. Transport, there isn't any public transport at all. I go up to my mother's in West London, I can't believe it, you know. Transport, accessibility, care for the older people, it's just not there. We're getting less money from government, we have lots and lots of commitments, and there are lots of tensions out there. So our stakeholders, you know, farmers resisting nature recovery because they believe food production is important. We're in the middle of all of these arguments. So where are we going? So it's quite challenging times. However, we can look to the past, and my background is heritage and archaeology, and I always think the past tells you how bad things were, so we should always remember that in lots of ways. So pre-1947, pre-National Health Service, careful what we wish for, but also it gives us examples of things that went well in the past, ways of looking at things. It gives us, so it's in some ways it shows us the good and the bad, and we can learn from that. And the people who should learn most are probably the people most senior in our society in terms of politicians. Politicians have amnesia from the past, I think. Very often we end up going around the same mistakes over and over again. We don't have to look too far in Europe to see that. So, that sounds like a rant, doesn't it? But let's get back to the 18th century when it all seemed to be going rather well. This wonderful description of coming into Exmoor from the Bristol, or the sort of Bristol, sort of central southern England. So coming into Exmoor from the east, if you like. And I'll show you a map of Exmoor in a minute. And this is Robert Southey, the poet, and he says, Cruikshank took me in his chair to Porlock. So Porlock's right on the east side of Exmoor, really up on the coast. 6 miles. Hedges luxuriantly high for the most part impede the view. In other words, I couldn't proceed very much because the hedges are grown out. Porlock is called in the neighbourhood the end of the world. Albeit, he hasn't got to Devon, you know, all beyond is inaccessible to carriage or even cart. A sort of sledge is used by the country people, resting upon 2 poles like cart shafts. Tom, you have talked of Somersetshire and its beauties, but you've never seen the finest part. The neighbourhood of Stowey, that's on the Quantocks, Minehead and Porlock, exceed anything I have seen in England before. If only beauty of landscape were to influence me in choice of residence, I should at once fix on Porlock. And I think that's just a wonderful way of describing it. But I particularly like the end of the world. You know, you've got to Porlock and, God, that's it. There's nothing else beyond that, apart from Devon and Cornwall. It's that view of it's so backward, it's so remote, it's so isolated, transport's so difficult. And so this is Exmoor, but it's Exmoor or Exmoor really, and I'll unpack it for you. So the line, the big line, if you like, is the national park. The county boundary is here, like that. Going out to the sea at Orr. So that bit's Devon, and that bit's, most of it, say about 2/3 is in Somerset. And that designation is basically a political designation, really, because when national parks were created, you think the government might have said, I know, let's have a National Parks Service, let's put a brigadier retired from the war in charge of it all, that would be the way to run it, wouldn't it? But what they realised was that there was so much aggravation from local landowners and local politicians about national parks, they had to be political. So the designation of Exmoor, you end up with this funny shape that is very hard won politically. So Brendan Hills are in, stretching out towards the Quantocks, but not some of this area, because Somerset were resisting the creation of the national park really strongly. Similar on the Devon side, and of course there are now bits on the Devon side that fought to be out of the national park, and in more recent years have fought to be in. They want to see the boundary change, they want to be in. So, you know, it's really interesting. But historically, that's not Exmoor. It is an arbitrary 1954 line, a cartographer's line drawn from political expediency. And this is the national park boundary, this is the area of the national park, but it's got no historical basis whatsoever. Old Exmoor is this, in effect. And it's Old Exmoor because this was the royal forest of Exmoor. And why is it Exmoor? Well, it's Exmoor because it's where the River Ex lies, and it's the moorland around Exmoor. And it happened to be owned by the Crown. And we'll unpack that a bit in a minute. So it's quite a small area. And when I first came to Exmoor, somebody said to me, I was talking about this area over here on the Brendon Hills, and they said, well, of course, that's not Exmoor proper. And I thought, that's a bit snotty, isn't it? You know? But it is snotty, actually, to say it like that. But it's sort of historically right. So ancient Exmoor is this. It's a much smaller area. The National Park designation basically was focused on moorlands, so everything that was moorland or open country, if you like. That's what the National Park designation sought to protect. But the historical one is that much smaller area. And that's the Royal Forest as created well over 1,000 years ago. I don't know whether I should say it now. I mean, Royal Forests were land owned by the Crown. We don't know when some of them started, so Exmoor, sometime in the Saxon period, it became a royal forest. People imagine a king charging around hunting deer. The monarch never came to Exmoor, not a single visit in 1,000 years. It was primarily owned as a larder for food, so wild deer and things like that were reserved to the Crown, but it was also a form of income. So local landowners could graze their animals up there in summer, and for which they paid for the privilege, and that provided a lucrative source of money for the Crown. Right. There's very little that you can point to in the landscape and say that's to do with the Royal Forest, but there's a place north of Simonsbath. This is the River Ex, running up here, going all the way up to Ex Head, where it rises, and that place there, just up here, is called Prayway. And Prayway, or the Pray, is the drift, and that's where animals were gathered in the Royal Forest. So although the Royal Forest is hard to find on Exmoor in terms of pointing to something in the landscape, you can say, well, that's to do with the Royal Forest. The Pray there, the Prayway, the place where you collected the animals, is a very recognisable place. Topographically, it's very set down. You could bring all your animals there and gather them, and then distribute them to whoever they belong to. But perhaps the most notable thing about the Royal Forest is it was uninhabited. Apart from one building in the middle of it, it was 20,000 acres of nothing. So there was no occupation whatsoever, no habitations, no homes, no farms, nothing. There were no formal roads, so it was really pack horse ways, just ditches and gullies and tracks where people went. Because it was so uninhabited, and because it was so close to the coast, the North Coast and the Bristol Channel, it became a place associated with smuggling, lawlessness. There were groups, there's a group there even at the beginning of the 19th century called the banditti, who were basically beyond the law. The way to think about it is that the way legal administration worked then was it ran out of the counties. So there were county constabularies, and basically, if you're on Exmoor, you're a long way from the centre of operations in Somerset, and similarly in Devon. So it was very, very literally beyond the reach of the law, beyond the arm of the law. So it was a place where things happened that wouldn't happen anywhere else. Now imagine that scenario for 1,000 years, beyond the law almost. It was also subject to its own law. And although it was called a forest, it had no trees on it to speak of, and the term forest is a legal one, meaning away from or other. So it actually had its own judicial system, which was not like a civil one. It was designed to control activities on the forest that the Crown wanted to control. It was extra-parochial, which means there was no parish. So you think about, in England, everywhere's in a parish. For those of you who do historical research, everywhere's in a parish, isn't it? Not Exmoor. Exmoor doesn't have a parish, it doesn't have a priest, it doesn't have a church, a parish church. It's outside. So all the things that we are familiar with are not there. And we're in southern England, which is, until 1815, it's like this, which is extraordinary. It's like nowhere else in southern England. But of course, that doesn't mean nobody lived there going way, way back in time. And I'm going to give you just a quick snapshot of the time depth. So because it's a landscape where nothing changed for 1,000 years, archaeology survives incredibly well, because basically medieval farmers didn't plough it all away or rearrange everything. I don't blame farmers, I'm just saying land use, if you like. And so when you go out onto this part of Exmoor, we find the traces, beautiful flint tools. This is probably flint from southern Wales. Flint doesn't occur in Exmoor, so all flints come in. Traces of hunter-gatherers who may or may not have looked like this individual. He looks a bit clean for me. He looks like he's had a shower in the morning, actually. But you see from the dots on the right, there's a number of sites all over Exmoor, but there's a particular focus on the northern side of the forest, and a few sites turning up, and there's more actually than on this map, on the southern side of the forest. That's around 8,000 years ago, and these are some of the best sites in the locality for Mesolithic activity. But the landscape really starts to be populated and used in complex ways by the settled communities in the Bronze Age, so roughly 4,000 years ago. So the hunter-gatherer in the previous slide is 8,000 years ago, this is 4,000 years ago. Don't worry, because I'm an archaeologist and I struggle with time like this. It's just vast, isn't it? And yet it's a blink of an eye in some ways as well. And if you go up onto the Royal Forest, you will find the most amazingly well-preserved archaeological sites. So this is 5 Barrows above the Poltimore Arms, how well you know that area, and a reconstruction of what the Chapman Barrows, which is a little further over, might have looked like. So these are hilltop barrow cemeteries where people were buried, but also there where rituals were practiced. You know, they were important centres, we think. It's not just for burial. And I always say to people, think of them like a churchyard, where, you know, you go to a churchyard, there's the church, there's all kinds of things going on, there's the food larder, you know, there's all kinds of things happening. And it happens over a long period of time. So those churchyards may have been in use for 1,000 years. Well, these barrows may have been in use for 1,000 years, taking burials and cremations over a very long period of time. They're not one-off structures. And they look particularly good under snow. Big monuments. So here's 5 barrows, and clearly they couldn't count in the Bronze Age. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Of course they could. There are 5 barrows depending on where you're standing. Actually, if you see them from a certain point, there are 5. If you see them somewhere else, there are more. And that's looking from 5 barrows north over Exmoor, over the landscape of the Royal Forest, and out to the coast. The pale blue at the top is not the sky, really, it's the sea and the edge of Exmoor there. And one of the things we do know about the Bronze Age, 4,000 years ago, is there was a climatic deterioration towards the end of the Bronze Age. So it got wetter and colder, and woodland declined, but also in the Bronze Age they were farming and they were clearing woodland. So in a sense that double whammy of people clearing woodland and the climate change meant, or the climate alteration at that point, meant that the moorlands came into existence and peat started to form very, very quickly. So that open landscape on the left there that we know so well, you know, is typical of Exmoor. You can see the remains of standing stones here. The way to think about it is those groups of standing stones may have been created in a landscape that was wooded at the time. So we see them as tiny stones in a big open landscape. Maybe not, maybe it was like this. So the great thing about this sort of time depth and looking at these sites and thinking about the environments at the time is you can see how the landscape's changed, and you can see how people have influenced that, but also responded to that change, as we will surely will over the next 50 to 100 years. And don't worry about this, but this is another map of dots, but I want you to get a sense of how busy the landscape is. So Simmons Wealth is just down here somewhere, and this is open moorland. It's Badgery and the rest of the names I'm not sure whether you'll be familiar with, but if you know them you can pick them out. The dots and symbols are all prehistoric monuments, and they are all from the Bronze Age. So these are houses, round houses, they are standing stones, they are fields, they are barrows, there are other monuments as well. So that's when I say about a complex landscape. This is a really well-occupied, busy landscape, say around 3,500 years ago. And it all comes shuddering to a halt in the first millennium BC. One of the interesting things before I leave the Bronze Age is this, again, very close to Simmersbath. Simmersbath's just, if you can imagine, is just before the Roman Lode. It's just off the slide. But this is a place called Burkham, or Roman Lode, and there's this enormous trench running up the hillside. It's 600 metres long, and it's like that. You get certainly a bungalow, and the chimney on the top of a bungalow in it, possibly more than that. It's very, very deep, and this is all the result of mining. And don't be fooled by the name, it's called Roman Lode, but it's probably not Roman. It's one thing it isn't. It is mining at various dates for iron ore, that's 600 metres long. That's an enormous extraction effort. If we go back to it, at the very top up here, very close to the beginning of it, there is evidence of Bronze Age exploitation there as well, Bronze Age mining. Now we know that, the clue's in the title really, we know in the Bronze Age they weren't after iron, because they haven't discovered that yet, so they're after copper. So it's possible that this is the only evidence so far, or certainly on Exmoor, but also sparse evidence in the West Country for Bronze Age exploitation of copper. So these people were pioneers. They were actually looking for and discovering copper and processing it. We need to do a lot more research on this to understand it better. But when you're out there going for a walk on a day like today, it's tempting to think nothing's ever happened in this place. You know, it's always been this lovely, bucolic, open, gorgeous landscape. But if you think about the Bronze Age, this may have been very heavily wooded. They were certainly doing industrial processes here, like mining for copper, smelting copper, and then making objects from copper. We haven't found the archaeology, but this tentative evidence up here suggests that's what they were doing. It's a far cry from what we see today. But sometimes, you know, the presence of people in these early periods is much, much stronger. So once we get into the Iron Age, there is a much more sort of, there's a stronger emphasis on territorial activity and status and communities and the relationships with each other. And there seems to have been in the early periods. So it becomes more warlike in inverted commas, but it's not that. It's much more territorial and boundaries and showing your status. So we get the emergence of really big enclosures, which we call hill forts. So much of our terminology in archaeology is post-Victorian. So it's big and it's got a massive bank round it. It must be a fort. Well, yeah, but people have big gate posts and gates, don't they? And electric gates. It doesn't mean they live in a fort. I mean, they're just very conscious of status and you stay out because I've got electric gates and they won't open for you. So it's that kind of sending a message to the world, and that's exactly what they were doing in the Iron Age. So, and in the Barle Valley, that beautiful valley that runs up, parallel with the River Exe, into that forest landscape, there are two. There's one here, this is a LiDAR image, so this is sort of, if you like, bouncing satellite data, bouncing data off the surface of the Earth to get a topographical image. And you get this feature here, just above Simmersbath's to the left, and the river crossing, and you get this, what we think is an incomplete hill fort. But far better is this one at Cow Castle, which I opened with when I started my talk, which is a hilltop hill fort. So it's got a bank and ditch that forms a circle all the way around it, or not circle, it encircles the hilltop. Now, these are not places where people lived, because there's no evidence of houses here, and we would see them. But they were used intensively, and they also happen to overlook where there's iron mining. So we think these sites partly relate to where iron ore, the natural resources of the landscape, were. So people were controlling those natural resources. Have you ever wondered about the county boundary? You probably haven't, I don't know. Maybe you have. But you know, sometimes I always think it's the obvious things that we don't notice. So we've got this Wigley National Park, Wigley county boundary that goes up, goes all the way through Exmoor, loops around the Royal Forest, goes back that way and straight to the sea. Well, why doesn't it go to the sea at Lynmouth? It's straight. It just goes over a watershed. It could go straight down the next valley into the sea at Lynmouth. Very easy. And we don't know is the answer, because we don't know things like that, even though it's blindingly obvious when you look at the map. That's odd. There are other oddities as well, which I don't know about. But if you go to this place, and this is, if you like, the county boundary is here. Well, I can't do it on this one. Sorry, that's the county boundary going around like that. So why doesn't it go straight down there to the sea, or to Lynmouth here? Why does it do that? Well, in this place here is one of, well, the biggest Iron Age promontory fault in England, at Wind Hill. So if you go to Lynmouth and go eastwards towards Porlock, you'll be going on this road, and hopefully you'll be looking at the road and not the view, otherwise you'll go over the edge. But what you won't be aware of is this massive earthwork coming down here, which then carries on down below the road cuts through it, is an Iron Age promontory earthwork, a bank and ditch, a massive structure, and that top left photograph shows you that. This is a site of huge importance and status, and it may be that when the boundary of the Royal Forest was fossilised, which later becomes the county boundary, it actually had to respect a territorial landholding here that was there by the Iron Age. Isn't it interesting, things like that? You can never prove that, and like the best theories, nobody can disprove what I've just said, but I can't prove it either. It's a good one. So back to the Royal Forest, 1,000 years plus of uninhabited landscape, smugglers, the banditti and everything else, and rather nice 17th century map that shows the Royal Forest. Don't rely on this as like the Ordnance Survey map. This is a conceptual map. What it shows is this is the Royal Forest, here in the middle. It's got boundary stones, it's got the two rivers coming out. You've got the Ex and the Barl. And Barl, but incidentally, means stream from the hills, which is pretty obvious. Ex is a name it's a British name, effectively a very early name, in common with other names that we give our rivers, like Thames, Ouse, but with the X you've got Axe, Usk, those sorts of names. They're quite guttural, I quite like them. So there's your forest. Here are the commons around the edge, and then beyond that is civilization, depicted by the parish churches. This is a map of the centre of the universe. Exmoor Forest is not the centre of the universe, but to this cartographer it is, so he's drawn it in the middle. So it's absolutely not a map you should use. Don't try and put it into your sat nav. It's one of those that is a conceptual, but it shows how important it was at the time. However, in 1815, the Crown decided that it wasn't worth keeping anymore. Rents were coming down from it. The grazing levies they were having were coming down. They decided it might be useful for trees, so they sent the Admiralty down, who basically said, there are 7. Now, what you've got to think about in 1815 is if you're the Admiralty and you're looking for trees, it's for a ship. So you're going around like this, and you're not seeing the trees on Exmoor, which are like this, so they didn't count them as trees, and we think there were more than 7. But basically, it wasn't worth anything. So the Crown instructed, basically began the process of disposing of the forest. And that had to be done by Act of Parliament. So Parliament basically appointed parliamentary commissioners, and there was this huge, complicated legal process that they went through, which took about 3 years, where the Royal Forest was broken up, and people had rights to it, were given rights. So the well-to-do, by and large, were given chunks of land in lieu of rights, and the Crown was given the main bit, 10,000 acres, in lieu of the forest ownership. And it was put to market. So in 1818, they advertised it for sale, and in August of that year, it became clear that Mr. John Knight of Worcestershire has purchased the allotment. The allotment is the king's allotment, the land given to the king, the land allotted to the king, 10,000 acres for £50,000, which was a vast amount of money at that point. The nearest comparable bidder gave 5,000, and that was the Ackland family. And as you know, being in Devon, they were shrewd. They knew what things were worth. That's why they're still here. And this guy bid 10 times as much, and so he got it. And then this wonderful phrase, which haunts me when I wake up at 5 in the morning: the property will, under the judicious plans in contemplation, become an enviable possession. These judicious plans in contemplation are the subject of a number of books, lots of sleepless nights for me, trying to work out what Mr. John Knight had in mind. And that's for the last bit of the talk. That's going to be, I'm going to give you a little bit of a tour of that and see where we go with it. It's still a work in progress. John Knight is so annoying because he wrote down so little. He had such big ideas and didn't commit them to paper. He'd do very well in the political world today because nobody can say, look, you know, he wouldn't have sent WhatsApp messages, I'm absolutely sure of that. In fact, we didn't know what he looked like until a few years ago when I started sort of getting obsessed with him, and that's a different story which Tony knows, but I won't go into that one. I realised that why can't I actually see his face? Why am I in a portrait of this guy? He was very well known. And then I found that thanks to wonderful online catalogues that the British Museum had a scrapbook that his daughter had written, and I went up to the British Museum and there's this sketch of him, which was probably done in about 30 seconds for those of you who can draw, and that is the only image of him that exists. And this is the end of the 18th century, 1767 to 1850. As a young man, it is inconceivable that he wasn't painted. So he's 70. He's in his 70s then, we think. And he's very Georgian, isn't he? That high collar, the kind of, all of this sort of stuff. Yeah, I can spend the next 20 minutes on this, I'm not going to. On Exmoor, we've always thought of the Knight family as family connected with the iron industry. They were hard-nosed, knew money, you know, it was all about money and trade and iron and making wire and, galvanising, I didn't call it galvanising then, but tin plating iron pots, because back then, 200 years ago, you would have had iron pots and they didn't last. They rusted and you got holes in and you threw them away. But if you tin plate them, they last a lot longer. So they were pioneers in that. So they made all their money. And this is John Knight's father, great-grandfather, grandfather, it all goes up that line. Really practical, solid iron masters, not anything else. And when I started looking at the family, there's another side to it all, which is they are absolutely, through those two individuals there, you've got Richard Payne Knight, who would be, you'd be sick of him by now because he would be on social media, he'd be in the news, he'd be above some of the figures we're sick of seeing in the news, and he'd just love it. He'd love the controversy. He said the Elgin marbles were overrated, and there's just like this approbation poured down on his head from everybody, and he loved it. So he's been called the Light Knight because he just was in the headlines all the time. You know, he just loved courting controversy. And that was John Knight's cousin. John Knight's uncle was Edward Knight. And in total contrast, he lived with his mum and his sister quietly in the West Midlands in a mansion. And he was reckoned to be one of the best art collectors of the day. But when he came to the big houses to go to the sale of art, he didn't go through the front door with all the lords and ladies, he had to go through the tradesman's entrance side because he's Mr. Knight, so he wasn't allowed in. And yet everybody knew his talent was just extraordinary. And today, amongst art collectors, he's still revered, and we know little about him. He's the Dark Knight. What an interesting pedigree that John Knight had. And how interesting on Exmoor that we think only of that side of him and have never really thought about the other side. John Knight, when he came to Exmoor in 1815, he had everything, which seems incredible. He had 2 castles in Worcestershire that had come from the money in the iron trade over 200 years. He had a hugely successful iron business. He was in the process, his first wife had died very young. I think she probably died in childbirth, and I'm not quite sure about that. He had 6 children. He actually had 7, and I only discovered that last year. This child, the first child, sort of just disappears. So obviously died within the first year. I don't think there's a baptism record either, so may have died earlier. But he had 6 children, 3 boys, 3 girls. Highly, everything perfect. And he basically sold everything in Worcestershire pretty well. He burnt all his bridges. He sold everything that was of value to come to Exmoor, to put it very simply. And what did he buy? He bought 10,000 acres of bog without a house. And he had to rent at Linton, for the first 10 years. And this is one of the great mysteries, and I love mysteries. I love not to know. I just don't want to know the answer. I'm not really bothered. Well, I am bothered, but it's the finding out. So why did he come to Exmoor? And why does it matter? Well, because he changed everything on Exmoor Forest. He changed everything just through that decision. We don't even know why. It's a time of vast optimism, so that could be it. It's a time of food shortages and uncertainty. Sounds like now, doesn't it, really? Without all the horses and charging around, but I'm sure that'll come. So it's an extraordinary time, and this is an extraordinary family. So, you don't have to go very far to see what we think about this time. And I do it for you, because go home and pick up Jane Austen and pick up Emma, and you are in that moment with that kind of family. This could be the Knight family at Simmons Bath. It's that time, it's that era. It's that privilege. And what John Knight did was change this landscape vastly. So I'm just going to, in the last few minutes, I'm going to take you through some of what he did. And it is still an unfolding process. So if you walk out onto from Simmons Bath or anywhere to Pinkery Pond or any of this landscape, headwaters of the Exe, you will be walking in that landscape. And this will hopefully give you a bit of a feel for some of the stuff. There's little documentation, but I'm going to come back to that. There's a lot of evidence in the landscape. In other words, the physical things you see when you go round, if you know how to read them. So what is just a rock on a hillside, as Tony well knows, is much, much more than that, and we'll return to that one. What looks like a pile of old stone falling down the hillside is actually where they made gateposts. It's a gatepost factory, because if you're going to reclaim this landscape and farm it, which is what John Knight wanted to do, you need gateposts. And the geology is not great on Exmoor, so this is somewhere you could get them from. So suddenly, things that seem like nothing seem important. Pinkery Pond, we don't know when it was built, 1820s, just after John Knight came. It's a reservoir, but what's it for? Why did he need all that water? We still don't really know. The documents are thin for John Knight, because I said he didn't write much down, but because I got interested in it, in 2016, we tracked down the last living relation of John Knight's, and she died last year. She was in a home when I got to her, so it was a husband who took me round. And in their loft in Kidderminster was the entire Knight family archive. So thousands and thousands of documents. And they were very elderly, the couple. And as a result of conversations I had with them, those records are all now in Taunton in the Somerset Record Office. And we have scans of quite a few of them. Some of them are mice have weed on or eaten, or both, in the right order hopefully, and so they can't be opened without conservation work. So there's decades of research here. Just out of interest, just for your interest really, I gave a talk like this in Minehead a few years ago, and the Minehead u3a had been working, we managed to scan some of these, so quite a lot of them, so they've been working through, and they've transcribed about 300 of the letters that we've got so far, which are starting to really sort of shed some light on, partly on what John Knight was doing, but a lot about connections and social connections and that sort of thing, and the life of the tenants. So there's a lot about money and lack of money and who's doing what and who didn't do what. There's legal paperwork, so these are all indentures and chancery papers, because if you know your Bleak House and Dickens, they spent a lot of time in court and huge amounts of money for no result. So yes, so that's, I said he didn't write anything down, but we're short of documentary evidence, but this has been the recent exception to that. We know that he was building a mansion, because he said so, in January 1820, so as soon as he came, and this is a block of it that was there at the end of the 19th century in Simmons Bath. If you know Simmons Bath, the Simmons Bath House Hotel is just behind it. And in fact, sorry I keep walking back and forth, but the hotel is here today, looks the same, but that huge lump of masonry is a fragment of the mansion that he began, but never finished. It's 1820, so what was it going to look like? And we don't know, because there are no architectural plans surviving, or I haven't found them yet. But at the same time, in North Wales, the immensely unpopular Thomas Hopper, sorry, not Thomas Hopper, he's the architect, but the Pennant family, who are incredibly unpopular in terms of their ownership of the slate industry, started building this. And for lots of complicated reasons I won't go into, I have a feeling that John Knight was thinking of something similar to that, but on a smaller scale. So it was a fashion for sort of almost Romanesque architecture at the time. It went out of fashion pretty quickly, But when you go to Simmersbath now, imagine something like this, and you would be heading to the car park and heading for the National Trust tea room, obviously, because that's what we do, things like that, and that's what you do at Penryn. But the one at Simmersbath didn't survive. So you've got a mansion, and the mansion would be there. We know there were plantations, either planned or actually executed, like that one. We know he had a tree nursery here. And we know he created what we'd call a picturesque garden in Ashcombe, and Tony has spent a long time in Ashcombe, and so have I, too long. As what we're trying to do in Ashcombe is bring back that picturesque garden. We have paths that survive, we have those white rocks, remember the white rocks that have been basically exposed by John Knight as something to look at, and it's a time when people looked to gardens to experience awe in nature. So rocky cascades, outcrops of rocks, carefully positioned buildings, naturalistic planting, all that sort of thing. Very different to what the Victorians did. William Robinson, people like that, a million miles away from this sort of gardening. That's what they did in Ashcombe. And for me, one of the interests is, this is one of the last picturesque gardens, but picturesque movement is the precursor of the National Parks movement. So it's the value of nature. Even back then, it's saying this matters. That fallen tree, don't tidy it up. It's amazing. Just leave it. So that very experiential side to gardening and the natural world was very much what the picturesque was about. So we have it here at Simmersbath, and like everything else with John Knight, it was unfinished. That gives you a little flavour of the kinds of things we have. And what we've been doing, we've done excavation, we've done some tree felling, this was ash dieback, and just opening up the landscape, and we've now planted over 700 trees in there. We've got some guys working out there this week. We've got a group of volunteers who've been involved for 4 years now, I think. Was it 3? I can't remember. And I'm not in a rush with this one. This is, gardening. Don't rush to the end. Just, there isn't an end anyway, so why are you rushing? So do it right, and just take your time and be iterative with it. So that's what we're doing. And I like to get young people involved and getting their hands dirty because it's archaeology. This is actually uncovering one of the garden paths, which we found was dressed with quartz, so white stones all along it. Those documentary records, I'm nearly at the end, those documentary records also explain some of the mysteries of Exmoor. If you know Exmoor, there's Pinkery Canal, which, what was that all about? We don't really know. And in our account book from 1819, which we found in the documents in Kidderminster, is an item which is the canal at Prayway, Pinkery, and the canal at Warren. These are tugboat canals, for the industrial amongst you. These are very narrow canals. That's what they look like today. It's not what you'd expect. This isn't the Grand Union and I booked my longboat holiday, narrowboat holiday. I mean, this is, you have to get away from all that. This is, I'm going for a swim in my bathtub almost. It's literally a bathtub down there. Right out over moorland, and they are very long. They're 8 kilometres each one on the south side of the Ex, one on the north side, in purple up here, these ones. By the way, all the other green lines and purple lines are all the drains and irrigation and moving water around the landscape that the Knights did in the 19th century. These are the highest canals in England, unless somebody shoots me down. They are twice as high as the next one. They're ridiculously high, because John Knight knew canals. He was involved in building the Stourbridge Canal. I know no railways at this point, but not quite. So yes, lots of water management, lots of model farms. John Knight, straight away, within a year of buying it, built a model farm at Cornham and one at Honeymead. He chose the names because it was an uninhabited landscape, Cornham and Honeymead. That's a bit of optimism at the beginning of the 19th century. And these survive today. Complicated water supply, so everything is water powered. Very, very efficient system. And he also built a series of crofts, effectively. Remember, we're in the West Country. This isn't vernacular buildings. This is a Scottish croft, as far as I'm concerned, because John Knight visited Scotland. His first wife was Scottish, and he chose his livestock from Scotland for Exmoor, and he also chose, I think, his buildings. So this one we restored a few years ago. It's called White Rock Cottage and happens to sit within the garden landscape that he was creating as well. So it sits in Ashcombe and it's part of that garden landscape. There's another one just like White Rock Cottage, and it was there. Now tell me this isn't picturesque. It's putting little cottages out in remote parts of the landscape. Or is this the Lammermuir Hills in the borders of Scotland, you know, which he knew so well? And this is the, no, it's not, it's Exmoor, but it could be the Lammermuir Hills. Those remote buildings are eye catchers, are they? Or are they practical, or are they both? And there's another one at Warren, which is sat in this ex-cleve, this great valley, and it's sat on top of a rocky knoll in the middle of the valley. Why would you do that if you were being practical? You'd tuck it down out of the weather, wouldn't you? But no, it's stuck on the hilltop, cut out of the rock. Right, 2 minutes. The progress of reclamation. John Knight did a lot in the first few years, and then something happened. We don't know what it is. I think his wife wasn't well, and that's the anecdotal evidence. I think she said, I won't swear, I'll try not to swear. I'm not having this anymore. I don't want to live in Simmons Bath. Take me away. And they hadn't even moved to Simmons Bath yet. So they moved to Jersey, and then they moved to Rome. And sometimes, when the weather's like it can be at Simmons Bath, as Tony knows too well, I think about going to live in Frascati as well. And sadly not, I'm not quite there yet. And so John Knight began, but then very quickly something changed. And isn't it fascinating? How can you not be interested in people with stuff like this? And what happened then was a change which was brought about by his son. So John Knight left with all his children who were growing up and left his eldest son in charge, Frederick Knight. And Frederick Knight basically carried on Exmoor until he died. And Frederick was practical. He wasn't going to create a Georgian state. He was going to make farms all over it and then get tenants to come in, and the tenants can farm this lot and take the risk and take the bad weather, but they're still paying their rent. And that was his approach, to put it very, very simply. So this is a farm called Larkborough, which is right out on the top, and is a model farm again, but from the late 1840s. And Frederick created, I can't remember how many, 10 farms, I think. And what was wonderful in that Kidderminster trove of letters was a letter from Frederick to his mother, who was living in Frascati, sipping away and looking out at the sunshine, and it wasn't in Simmons Bath. And this letter is Frederick. It says, my dear Mama, it's long since I wrote to you, but I can read it over here, but I do hold it a principle that when, I can't, it's too small, that when one has nothing, shut up, I'm interrupting him. But when one has nothing agreeable to say or communicate, it is best to be silent and neither speak or write. So just bear that in mind when you're sending a Christmas card and you're thinking, what's my excuse? You know, I didn't have anything interesting to say. You know, so it's best to be quiet. I have now, however, a good deal of news for you. The unhappy writer, Frederick, after much mature consideration of his circumstances, his family, and what is more to the purpose, his fate, finds it adverse and finds himself annually compelled to remain for the present in England. Permanently in England. Exmoor, Downton, what the devil is to be done? I am farmer, deuced disagreeable, going to Parliament, uncommon stupid, and yet fate is fate, and the man who was born, etc. Downton was an inheritance they never got, which is what they were hoping for. Exmoor was a can of worms and a problem financially, so he's like, what are my options here? He carries on running Exmoor. They never inherit Downton. And he goes into Parliament for 44 years, and he's one of the longest serving MPs. And he goes on to the Poor Board, where he basically does great work in terms of influencing the conditions of the poor in Victorian England. So my youngest son is called Frederick. Not his main name, his second name. So a great letter, and that's a life letter. I've never written one, where it says, okay, Mum, I'm not doing this anymore, I'm doing this and this, and that's what he does for the rest of his life. And my God, the map colours in at that point. There's loads of activity in the 1840s and 50s. And so when you go to a farm like Larkborough, it is one of the most extraordinary places because the entire farm, the entire landscape was laid out in about 10 years. And we now have we have the archaeology out there to look in the landscape, but we also have the written word to go with it. So it's a letter from Frederick Knight's agent to Frederick saying, give me £100 and we can do all these further improvements at Larkborough. So we know what they did and we know what they wanted to do out there. That's fabulous in terms of agricultural history. For those of you who are worried about what these little clumps of trees are everywhere on Exmoor, these are sheep stalls. Because when the farming doesn't pay and the tenants will go bankrupt, mostly, Frederick decides to go back to shepherding and bringing in large flocks of sheep. Well, where would you do that? Because nobody down here has the right sheep anyway. And if you're on the top of Exmoor, you need sheep that are much more coping with higher ground. So you go to the borders of Scotland. So you follow his dad, you go back up to the borders of Scotland, and you get the sheep, but you get the shepherds with them, even better. So a whole tranche of shepherds come down from Scotland in the 1860s and 70s, descendants of whom still live on Exmoor, descendants of their sheep still on Exmoor. That's why you see black-faced sheep, Scotch black-face on Exmoor. And which means that we know that these Scottish stalls were built by those shepherds, because nobody else would have done. But we also know the names of the shepherds who built them, because we have the records. So isn't that rather wonderful? They look like they've been there forever, and you'd be forgiven for saying they look ancient. They're only 160 years old, and they go into the landscape beautifully. So, what's it all for, I suppose, is my point at the end. I go back to everything I've told you today is about what national parks should be about, I think. It's about understanding and learning from the mistakes of the past and the things that went well in the past, but always trying to understand the past. But fundamentally, we're here for the nation. You know, this is me quite a long time ago with my grown-up children, and you know, we're understanding the past. You know, these are wartime memories. You know, we're there for the education of children, but the enjoyment of children and why they're separate. They shouldn't be. And you know, it's so basic. You know, you don't. That's an A and B on the left with Christopher Robin, but any protected landscape or anywhere actually. Why are children so removed from the natural environment now? And it's interesting that in this slide, my boss is our chief executive. That's her children, who are grown up now, are just doing what children should do in protected landscapes. And we should embrace that. But at the same time, we have this heavy responsibility for where else in a landscape in southern England would you see this? Herds of wild animals in what would look like a prairie landscape. So it's quite a responsibility, but it's also an exciting one. So thank you very much for listening.